Hello, colleagues. Thank you for joining us. It's a warm welcome that we're sharing with you from the University of London, our Centre for Online and Distance Education, and our institute in Paris. Very pleased to have you here for our event today. This is part of our Experiences in Digital Learning webinar series. We're in our third year on this, and really important topic, I think, today, and one that many people will, I think, have considerable interest in. So I'm going to hand over to Norbert Pachler from UCL and a Centre for Online and Distance Education fellow who's going to chair our event today. Excuse me. Over to you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, Linda. And can I add my welcome to all of you. It's great to see so many of you taking time out in this busy time of the year to join us and hear from our speakers today, who will be shedding light on the topic of understanding our evolving digital practice. I don't think I need to say very much at all about the significant growth of importance of technology, both in terms of our campus-based teaching and learning, but also, of course, in terms of the affordances and growth in capabilities in terms of online and distance education. And of course, it is incumbent on us to try and approach our own contribution to this field, be it particularly as practitioners, but also, of course, as institutional decision makers and indeed as researchers, to further a growth in the understanding of the dynamics that unfold once you introduce technological capabilities into teaching and learning. And of course, as a Centre for Online and Distance Education, we've got a particular interest in the pedagogical dimension, and we're very pleased indeed to have two colleagues with us today, three colleagues, I think, who will be providing their own perspectives on this. Before I hand over, though, let me just remind you, just in case you haven't seen it, of the work the Higher Education Academy undertook a few years ago on trying to focus in on how the notion of a scholarship of teaching and learning could really help us in furthering our understanding of this particular domain. And those of you who may have seen the report will recall that the report offers up subtle, as it were, as a capacity building framework, and it identifies not just the contribution that nexus between research and practice can offer in terms of our micro level activities about our curriculum development, our pedagogical practice, our focus in supporting student learning, but also more broadly about how that can help develop change and boundary crossing, facilitated, amongst other things, through evidence-based and evidence-informed professional development, and with a great focus also on institutional specificity. So I would want to locate the discussion that we're going to be having today within this broader imperative of recognizing the benefits of inquiry-based, research-informed approaches to technology-enhanced teaching and learning. And I'm really excited and look forward to hearing from our speakers about their exploits in this particular context. I think, Linda, if I'm not mistaken, what we're going to do is we're going to invite our colleagues to speak for about 15 minutes, and we will then have 5 to 10 minutes discussion about the individual contribution. After we've discussed Peter's input, I think we will then have an opportunity maybe to broaden things out a little bit in the last few minutes. So I see you're nodding, Linda. So on that basis, can I hand over to Denise, please, and welcome the first set of contributions. Over to you.
So Jess, I think Jess and I are going to share some slides, and we might sort of complement each other if there are comments in regard to the slides. So welcome everybody. One thing I did want to say is that there are other colleagues whose names aren't on the slides that have been working with us in the pilot, which we did in lockdown. So I would like to shout out to those that aren't here that have supported us, and also to all the scholars and advisors who are part of the pilot, because we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. So firstly, I think I can I move the slides, Jess, or have I got, I think,
okay.
What do I do? Yeah, okay, great. I think I just would need to press an arrow, but we've got a few slides, and there's just a few little things that I wanted to just share with you before we started. We are part of ALT and LSIG. LSIG was a special interest group that was set up around evaluating learners' experience of using technology, and it's been around a while, and it got a lot of JISC funding in the beginning, and then we moved into ALT just a couple of years ago, which is the Association for Learning Technology. But we had this sort of harebrained idea a few years ago about trying to, first of all, a lot of us are people who are practitioners foremost that are wanting to get more into scholarship. So we thought, and that's how we started this scheme, was that we're practitioners, we don't necessarily have a lot of research record. A number of us have had these portfolio careers where we've been in a range of different jobs. So we set up the pilot, and these are some of the ideas. It was around COVID that brought that into it. So everything we did was online. I suppose in another time we might have wanted to have mixed modes and do some face-to-face as well. But one of the things was we had 3 strands of pathways that people were involved in the scheme, which I have a feeling it might be on another slide, but anyway, I will go. So the origin of the idea was we were all people who were struggling with our own scholarship. We had asked Brett Bly, who's at Lancaster University, to do a presentation at one of the ALT winter conferences where he tried to pull through what's going on with the learning technology space and scholarship. So that kind of got us getting into some sort of foundation. And then it was this thing around trying to develop professionals mainly. A lot of the people that were in the pilot aren't in academic posts, but some of them are. And we wanted to disseminate work. So I think if I go, okay. So what was involved? We decided on putting out an expression of interest, which then led to a meeting where those that were interested in the pilot came together. But in that expression of interest, they were asked to talk about their interests, what pathways. So there were 3 pathways, which are those, what we've got here is 3 categories. People who might be new, could be someone who's started in maybe one role and then moving into a learning technology role. So they didn't really know many, they wanted to build a network. Then we knew that there were some colleagues who were sort of mid-career, maybe wanting to go for a senior fellowship, either of the advanced HE, the fellowship, or maybe CMALT, which was the ALT qualification. And then we knew that there was a pathway about developing publishing plans and things around trying to kickstart and motivate yourself if you're quite new to publishing, and building up support for colleagues that may have felt like, I'm coming from one disciplinary background and I'm moving into another one, and I need some hand holding along the way. So that was it. So we paired people up. So there was a scholar and advisor. But I would like to say it was very reciprocal. A lot of advisors that signed up were wanting to learn and share. It wasn't just about expert to novice at all. So it was a very reciprocal thing. And those of us that were advisors would all say we learned a lot from working with scholars. So next slide. We had about 50 people that signed up. I'm not saying that everyone finished the scheme. I think that for a lot of us working in this learning technology space in lockdown, we're working very extreme hours, doing a lot of different things. And we did have people coming in and then some having to leave, maybe job restructures, workload issues, and sometimes some maybe breakdown between scholars and advisors. There were a few of those situations. So that was who was involved. And we did have a few people who had come from private university situations, not just all public. And there were a few people originally not from the UK. So we did have a little bit of some international staff as well. Now I'm going to hand over to Jess around how we set up a research project, and Jess and I are the sort of co-investigators on that. So Jess?
So again, a massive shout out to our colleagues who aren't here today, but who are very instrumental in the evaluation and the research. The idea behind this is we wanted to evaluate the scheme. Did it have potential? Was it just a response to a moment in time? And how do we sustain it? How do we grow it? But whilst we were talking, and the team that were involved in this, so it includes my colleague Brett Bly from Lancaster, Tunde Viber-Atkins from Liverpool, and Jim Turner from Liverpool John Moores, we discovered some research questions that we wanted to explore further. There was some issues around identity, the opportunities to engage in SOTL, how accessible was it, how was it built into work patterns, and then how the scheme itself evolved, what other areas could we develop. So we came up with a few challenges along the way, and we developed an evaluation plan and a strategy, and it took part over the duration of the scheme. So we had an entry point where there was a pre-scheme survey where everyone was really enthusiastic. They shared their hopes, what they wanted to get out of the scheme, but also their challenges that they experienced with regards to engaging with SOTL within their workplace, because as Denise alluded to, it's not always part of their work, and they were finding that and more, as was mentioned earlier by Norbert, that inquiry-based approaches to our work is more evident, more needed, perhaps more than ever. So there's some real conflicting contradictions. So we established that in the pre-survey scheme. Then throughout, we invited colleagues who took part as advisors and scholars to keep confidence logs. So we just used some prompt questions, and that was to help them reflect as they went through on how the scheme was working, and to have touch points to see where their evolving practice may be. And then we had a post-scheme survey. And again, as Denise alluded to, not everyone was able to complete the scheme, but we did have good take-up with those colleagues who completed the survey and explained initial thoughts as to why that may have been the case. But then the post-scheme interviews was an opportunity for us to really delve deeper into the reasoning and into their individual stories around SOTL, both within the wider context with which they're working and their identity within the SOTL, but also how the scholar scheme itself had worked and supported them, and the challenges that they faced by engaging in the scheme as well. So as I mentioned, it's part of that evaluation is part of a bigger research project, a multi-institutional research project. We had to go through the ethical processes, and publications are imminent. So watch this space. We'll share more on that shortly in due course. Initial findings. So the initial survey helped us to understand some key motivations as to why people took up their part within the scheme, their hopes and aspirations, and did this live up to their expectations. And we were able to find that and draw that out through the conversations that we had with colleagues towards the end of the scheme. So the initial, as I mentioned, there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of eagerness to engage and hoping that this would fix some of the problems. And whilst there was some really good outputs from the scheme and some brilliant opportunities to network and collaborate, we recognised the challenges didn't necessarily go away. We weren't able to wave a wand and magic time out of nowhere. So there were still challenges that we needed to address. So we did carry out 17 semi-structured interviews for about an hour with a range of scholars and advisors. And as I said, some of those colleagues that completed the scheme, saw it all the way through, some didn't, but were really happy to share their story. And they shared their personal stories, their experiences of engaging with SOTL and their experiences of the scheme and how that had impacted on their practice. And it was really interesting to hear the anecdotes around what they went on to do next, the connections that were made. We also had the opportunity to work with Brett Bly from University of Lancaster, and he introduced us to activity theory approach to analysing our data, because we were conscious, as we were all part of the research team, we were also advisors, and we wanted to get an insight into the scheme that was subjective. And we all had out, I want this to work. I want a good story out of this. But by using activity theory, we could sort of look at the system as a whole and draw out areas and have a more holistic view of the data that was being produced from our interviews with colleagues. So every single interview was mapped to activity theory, looking at the community, the division of labour, the objects, what it was they were trying to achieve, looking for those contradictions. Time was a big factor. This is an exemplar. This is based on a mixture of considerations, but just to give you an oversight as to some of the areas where what people were trying to do, and we're looking at it as a whole, and we did this, as I say, with advisors and scholars to get a really broad picture so that we could see why people were coming to us, what they were experiencing, where those challenges were. We heard lots of personal stories. We had lots of challenges with regards to time. COVID was a massive factor. As Denise said, a lot of our colleagues work in academic technology and we're supporting people, and it was the busiest time, as we all know, and that was proved to be one of the biggest challenges there. But by having this approach to our research, not only were we hoping to develop colleagues with their SOTL skills, we were also developing our own skills in this area, and definitely elements of this we'll take further forward. So where next? I don't know, Denise, did you want to say anything else about the research before we move on?
No, I think we didn't. Today's maybe not the space to share too much more around it, but it was good. There were some similarities between some of the experiences for advisors and for scholars, but then there were quite unique things. And what we were trying to do is what might be unique to your institution doesn't mean that all scholars had the same experience or all the advisors. So there's that's really interesting. But as you say, it's ongoing, and it's been interesting for us to sort of steal time from our workloads to keep that. And that's the one thing I think about in social sciences, working not on your own, but with a group of people forces you to actually produce something. So that's a suggestion. So it's ongoing. But yeah, no, I have nothing else. Thanks, Jess.
And just to say, we've literally just launched the next iteration. So the pilot phase is ended. We've launched the 2023. We've listened, we've heard, we've responded to those interviews and evaluation. We've built in more group support, which was a really valued aspect of it. And we're not stopping with the research. So we're also endeavouring to ensure that we develop the scheme, we develop our own SOTL skills, and we develop those that engage with us as well. So it's a real community-based approach, and there's a lot of colleagues that are involved that are helping make this happen. I'm conscious people have appeared on the screen. So just to say, LESIG, if you want to get involved, do have a look at our webpage, visit us on Gmail, follow us on Twitter. We do a lot of other things as well. Scholars Scheme is one aspect of it. So we'd love to hear from you. I'll stop sharing.
And can I now hand over to Peter and thank Peter very much to join us from afar. I hope the time difference is not too challenging for you. Over to you, Peter. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Norbert. Thanks, Linda and Matt, also for organizing everything. Denise and Jess, thanks for a really stimulating session and setup. And apologies for my funny accent. As you can probably tell, I'm in the United States. I'm at Elon University, which is in North Carolina, predominantly undergraduate. institution. And my role is different than what Denise and Jess have been describing, but it still probably fits in what I have seen Emily McIntosh and Diane Nutt call a third space role. So it's a mix of a little bit of teaching, quite a bit of admin, and some degree of research. And my career, actually, to pick right up on what Norbert was saying, I wasn't a researcher at all as I began this work in the third space back in the days of cassette tapes. And scholarship of teaching and learning has really enabled me and been an approach that's enabled me to work on my own teaching and learning, and then to take that work towards a meso and a macro level. And what I want to do is share a little bit of my own experience and a little bit of research that seems to align with what we're talking about here. So I hope everyone can see slides. If you can't, please let me know.
Yeah, works well.
Great. Okay. Well, in this, my session is going to begin in a bit like Denise and Jess, thinking about my own experience as a teacher during the pandemic. So not so much thinking about the other third space roles, but really thinking about my teaching role as a pandemic. And I was struck by and inspired by, I'm a historian by training, and I was really struck by an essay published by Arundhati Roy in April of 2020. So, we were just in the US a month into our lockdown, and she wrote this. And you can see this, but I'll read parts of it just to be clear, that historically pandemics have forced humans to break from the past. They act like a portal, a gateway between the old world and the new. And what I found so powerful in her essay was the closing, which she says, so if we're going through this portal, we have a choice to make. What do we bring with us and what do we leave behind? And she advocates for walking lightly with little luggage into this new world. I'm ready to fight for the things that really matter in it, and leaving behind what she calls our prejudices and hatred, data banks, dead ideas. If you recall what was happening in the United States in this April of 2020 and the year of 2020, there was quite a lot of prejudice and hatred and dead ideas floating around. So this really resonated with me, and I was invited. So I did a lot of thinking about this and talking with some colleagues about this, and I was invited to write a little essay. All my citations are at the end of my slides, which you have. And I wrote an essay saying, so what am I going to bring with me if I bring Arundhati Roy's idea? What am I bringing with me into the new form of teaching and learning that I want to enact as we go through the pandemic as a portal? And I've actually changed my thinking a little bit from what I wrote. So this is not exactly what I wrote, but fundamentally, I would say I want to bring four things, which is a real commitment to these four things. First, to meaning. And so that education is meaning making. It needs to be contextual. It needs to matter to the people involved in this work. Second, a deep commitment to equity. We saw how in the US, at least, the pandemic reinforced, magnified existing equity gaps that are really powerful in our society and in the higher education. And I want the future of teaching and learning to be committed to much more equitable approaches. A third thing is a sense of agency for students, but also for staff and academic faculty. I think one of the things the pandemic did for many of us is rob us of this sense that we have any control over what's happening. Maybe it reminded us that we don't have as much control as we like to believe, but I think really centering agency in teaching and learning is crucial. And then fourth and final, and for the purposes today, most important, a commitment to doing relational work. And Kathy Bovell in the UK has written a brilliant book about relational teaching. Other people, Karen Gravitt and others, are writing about this too. I've done some writing with colleagues on this topic. And in fact, so the book on the left, Relationship Rich Education, came out in 2020. We turned in the manuscript just before the pandemic hit. And the second book, Connections Are Everything, which is for students, is going to be published this summer. The open access version is actually available live right now from Johns Hopkins. When I get back to the chat, I will post a link to that. It's also in the slides, but that book is free online for students. And the key here is these books are based on the literature that exists, so it's evidence informed. But also my colleagues and I conducted about 400 interviews. About 500 interviews with students, faculty, and staff, about 300 students and the rest faculty and staff at about 36 higher education institutions across the US, quite a range of institutions, quite a range of students. And what I want to do is tell you two stories, one that comes right out of this work and one that emerges out of this work about research that is changing my practice and thinking about my practice and how my practice is connected to research and vice versa. The first, though, is to think about what happened during the pandemic. My institution, Elon University, is strongly committed to residential education. We have small classes. Our biggest class is 33 students. Almost all our students live on campus, come from predominantly the United States and all across the United States. Undergraduates do, but a bit around the world. But we're really committed to small classes and relational experiences. And so I had read a lot about online teaching, but I had done no online teaching until March of 2020. And so one of the things I did is look into the literature, and there's a brilliant book, it's in my citations, by Rebecca Glaser, that came out in early 2020, called Connecting in the Online Classroom, which is about building human connections in online teaching and learning. And Glaser makes a lot of good points, but to summarize, one of the things she says is there's 4 ways she suggests we can think about building human connections. We as instructors, we as academic developers can think about building connections, and it's humanizing the instructor, providing feedback, personalized feedback, reaching out to students, really taking it as our requirement to reach out to students, not just waiting for students to respond. And then finally, supporting student-peer collaboration. The 2 stories I want to tell in the next 8 minutes are tied to this personalized feedback. And the first one actually doesn't come out of my teaching, it comes out of my research. So as I mentioned, for the book Connections Are Everything, we interviewed scores and scores of students in the summer of 2021. And one of the students I interviewed, I actually did this interview, was a student named Nellie Bourne. She was living in Texas, in San Antonio at the time. She was just finished her first year as an undergraduate. Nellie actually is from the UK, her family came to the US when she was about 10. And she was excited about being a student, but nervous about beginning higher education. She began in the summer of 2020. So when everything was on full lockdown, everything was fully remote. All her classes, it turns out, were asynchronous. And I asked her, because our interviews were about the way students built connections with other humans in their education. I asked Nellie if she had a mentor, and she described her mentor. And to out myself a little bit here, I had a really hard time believing what she was saying, because she was saying her mentor was an online teacher, totally asynchronous. And so I kept probing into this. And Nellie, Matt is going to be the voice of Nellie for a minute. This is how Nellie described what this teacher did in this asynchronous online course, the first course Nellie took in higher education. Here you go, Matt.
On some papers, she would have this little paragraph in the comments saying, "You did this super well in your paper." And that little bit of encouragement, even though I'm not face to face with this teacher at all, made a world of difference to me. We've never met in person or even had a conversation, but she has made a huge positive difference in my education, which is kind of hard to do when you're not actually interacting with students in a classroom or on Zoom.
Thanks, Matt. And again, I, as someone who is deeply immersed in face-to-face teaching, really had a hard time really hearing what Nellie was saying about how the feedback on her papers was so powerful to Nellie that even without conversations, even without meeting on Zoom or in face-to-face, Nellie saw this professor as a mentor. In fact, Nellie said she took another class, a 19th century American literature course, in the fall of 2020, from this same professor, also asynchronous, also online, because she wanted to continue to receive feedback on her papers from this professor. And when I interviewed Nellie in the summer of 2021, she said they never had a conversation, but she still saw this person as a mentor because how personalized the feedback was. And so that interview got me thinking about my own teaching, and I have started to employ audio feedback on papers now in my teaching. I am face-to-face with my students now, but I typically don't give feedback face-to-face. I typically do it in a written form because I have too many students and not enough time. And so using audio feedback is a way for me to use a digitally enhanced tool to really try to personalize the feedback. That means I'm using students' names as I'm giving them feedback. I'm highlighting what their strengths are as well as what needs to be developed. So in this way, my research, somewhat unexpectedly, pushed into my practice. Second example I want to give is also tied to personalized feedback, but this is really thinking about personalized feedback at scale. And this is from work that's being done at University of Technology, Sydney. I am a small part on a project related to this, and the lead person, Lisa Angelique Lim, is doing, and her colleagues are really doing amazing work. This is from a study that was published last December. A very large, well, more than 100 students postgraduate course during lockdown. So all the students are remote. In fact, most of the students are outside of Australia during this course. And what Lisa and her colleagues were trying to do was use personalized feedback to build a sense of belonging and connection for these students, knowing how difficult that would be. One of the tools they used for but they had hundreds of students, so they couldn't do what I do, which is personalized feedback and one-on-one conversations. And so they used a tool called On Task to automate personalized feedback. So there were a series of assessments through the course, through the module, and based on student performance, students received a customized, personalized email with their feedback. Now, these were standardized in some ways. The student didn't realize that, but it was based on their performance that generated specific emails that Lisa and her colleagues had written in advance. And Lisa and her colleagues in this paper use LMS data, they use student performance data, they use survey responses, and they use focus groups to dig into this research and to get a sense of what this research suggests about personalized feedback. And one of the things that really struck me about their research and why I recommend it so highly is what they found is the way students experienced this personalized feedback, even at scale. And so this is an unnamed student on page 6 in their paper, but the student writes about how when they received feedback, automated feedback, it turns out, that said, I believe in your abilities, I believe you'll be successful, I can't wait to see you in the next virtual class. That was really motivational. And Lisa and colleagues demonstrate in this paper that this one student was not unusual in this, but that really this was clear, and it's possible to do this kind of personalized feedback, even at scale, even fully online, even fully remote and internationally dispersed. So really powerful ways to give personalized feedback to help students feel like they belong and connect. All of this for me, to get back to the theme of this session, is to think about how we can blend research-informed practice with an inquiry orientation. And then with some sort of community, like Denise and Jess were talking about, like I've been lucky enough to be experienced in. And that really does set you up. It sets me up well. I think it sets others up well for being involved in some sort of scholarly teaching work. Last thing I'll say is my work, like everybody else's, always builds on the research of many others. So I just want to nod to this. You have the citations in my slides, and I hope we have some time for conversation.